I used to drive for Uber late at night. Better tips, less traffic. One night, around 2 a.m., I got a request from a location just outside the city. A desolate stretch of road near an old cemetery. The passenger's name was Elias. No last name. Something about it felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. When I arrived, there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the distant sound of crickets. My GPS flickered for a second, recalibrating, like it had trouble pinpointing the location. The streetlights barely illuminated the cracked pavement. The trees along the road stood still, no wind, no movement. I was about to cancel the ride when the back door opened and a man slid in. His skin was eerily pale, almost translucent under the dim streetlight. His eyes were deep-set, dark, and unblinking, like they hadn't closed in decades. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you see in black and white photos, slightly damp as if he had just stepped out of the ground. A faint smell of damp earth filled the car. He didn't speak, just gave a slow nod when I confirmed his name. The ride was silent. Too silent. No breathing, no shifting, nothing. Just the occasional flicker of his reflection in the rearview mirror. And that was the worst part, his reflection. It lagged a half-second behind, like a bad video glitch. His lips would part in the mirror a moment after he had already moved in real life. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Long night?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Nothing. Heading home." Silence. The temperature in the car dropped. My breath fogged up the windshield, but his side of the glass remained perfectly clear. My radio crackled faintly, though I hadn't turned it on. A whisper of static, almost forming words. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and for a split second, I thought I saw his mouth moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. We reached the destination, a house at the end of an abandoned road. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown. No lights, no signs of life. "We're here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Still nothing. I turned around. The seat was empty, but the door had never opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. Heart pounding, I flicked my gaze to the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw him, sitting there, staring at me. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear until I could. "Take me home." The whisper wasn't coming from the mirror. It was right behind me. A wave of cold air brushed against my neck, and I felt something press lightly against my shoulder. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away without looking back. My hands were shaking, white-knuckled around the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station on the other side of town. Heart pounding, I yanked my phone out, ready to report the ride. But when I opened the app, no record of the trip, no passenger named Elias. Shaking, I reached into the glove compartment for a pen. My fingers brushed against something dry and brittle. I pulled it out. An old, crumbling newspaper. The headline, "Local man dies in taxi accident, 1932. The photo underneath showed a man in an old-fashioned suit, eerily familiar. The article said he had died in a car crash on this very road, trying to get home after a night out. The driver had fled the scene, never identified. I looked at my rearview mirror one last time. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, Elias was there. He smiled. Then he was gone. I deleted the app that night and never drove again. It was a rainy night, the kind where the city streets turn into shimmering rivers and headlights blur against the soaked asphalt. I had been driving for Uber for a few months, mostly late-night shifts. Fewer cars on the road, fewer distractions. At around 2:30 a.m., I got a request from a location I didn't immediately recognize. The passenger's name was Marcos. I accepted the ride and followed the GPS directions, which took me farther from the city center, into dimly lit, unfamiliar streets. When I arrived at the pickup spot, a narrow road lined with old apartment buildings, I didn't see anyone waiting. Slowing down, I glanced around, searching for my passenger. That's when I noticed a figure stepping out from the shadows of a nearby alley. He wore a dark jacket with the hood pulled over his head, obscuring most of his face. Something about his slow, deliberate movements unsettled me, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Marcos got into the back seat without a word. I confirmed his name, and he simply nodded. The moment I pulled away from the curb, a strange tension filled the car. The silence was suffocating. I decided to break it. "Long night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Marcos slowly turned his head toward me. Through the rearview mirror, our eyes met for the first time. His eyes were so dark they almost looked black, and there was something unsettling in them, something that made me instinctively avert my gaze. "You shouldn't be driving here this late." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something weighty in his words. I forced a nervous chuckle. "Why is that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, watching the raindrops streak down the glass. Things happen. The road ahead was nearly deserted. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the wet pavement. Marco spoke again, his tone even quieter this time. "Have you heard about the drivers who disappeared in this area?" A chill ran down my spine. "No, can't say I have. They take passengers who seem normal." His voice trailed off as he exhaled deeply. "And they never reach their destination." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're messing with me, right?" Marcos didn't respond. He just smiled. A slow, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then the GPS glitched. The screen flickered and the route recalibrated, redirecting us down a different road, a darker one with no streetlights. Marcos leaned forward slightly. "This is where they vanish." I slammed on the brakes. My breath hitched in my throat. When I turned to look at him, the back seat was empty, but the door had never opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. My phone screen flickered again. When I looked down at the Uber app, no record of the trip, no passenger named Marcos. A wave of nausea hit me. My hands trembled as I checked the rearview mirror. For a split second, he was there, sitting in the back seat, watching me. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, until the radio, which had been off the entire ride, crackled with static. A whisper came through. "You're next." I turned around, but the seat was empty again. When I looked down, there was something on the seat where he had been sitting. A damp, folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. It was an old, crumbling flyer, missing, Uber driver last seen in this area. The face on it looked eerily familiar. It was mine. I deleted the app that night and never drove again. Driving for Uber in Indianapolis had its challenges, but the night shifts were usually uneventful. That changed on September 8, 2024. Around 3:30 a.m., I accepted a ride request from a user named Chanty. The pickup location was a well-known strip club downtown. Upon arrival, a woman in her early 30s approached my car. She had a tired yet friendly demeanor and introduced herself as Chanty. As she settled into the back seat, she mentioned she was heading home after a long shift. I nodded, inputting her address into the GPS. The drive began like any other. Chanty and I chatted about mundane topics, the unpredictable Midwest weather, favorite local diners, and the quirks of night shift work. She spoke lovingly of her 2 children, sharing stories that painted a picture of a devoted mother. As we left the city lights behind, the roads became darker and less familiar. The GPS directed us onto a secluded route, supposedly a shortcut to her neighborhood. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I dismissed it, focusing on the conversation. Suddenly, Chanty's tone shifted. She became quiet, her gaze fixed out the window. I glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing her tense expression. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated before replying, I think we're being followed." A chill ran down my spine. I checked the mirrors but saw nothing unusual. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "There's been a car behind us since we left the club." I hadn't noticed any vehicle trailing us, but the winding roads and dense trees could easily conceal one. I decided to take the next turn, deviating from the GPS route to see if anyone followed. As I made the turn, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance, moving slowly. My heart raced. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," I suggested, trying to calm both of us. Chanty didn't respond. Her eyes were wide with fear. The road ahead was desolate, with no signs of civilization. I decided to pull over under a dim streetlight to let the car pass. But it didn't. Instead, it stopped a few yards behind us. "Lock the doors," Chanty whispered. I complied, my hands trembling. The other car's engine idled, its headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. Minutes felt like hours. Then, without warning, the car reversed and sped away, disappearing into the night. We both exhaled, the tension easing slightly. "Let's get you home," I said, forcing a smile. Chanty nodded, her body relaxing. As we continued, the GPS recalculated, leading us back to the main road. The rest of the drive was silent, the earlier camaraderie replaced by lingering fear. Finally, we arrived at her address, a modest house with a porch light flickering. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Anytime." "Stay safe," I replied. She exited the car and walked to her door, glancing back once before disappearing inside. I waited until she was safely indoors before driving away, the night's events replaying in my mind. The next morning, I received a notification from Uber about a news article. Curious, I opened it. My blood ran cold. The article detailed the discovery of a woman's body in a wooded area near the route we had taken. The victim was identified as Chanty Dixon, the passenger I had dropped off just hours earlier. The report stated she had been assaulted and killed shortly after returning home. I felt a wave of nausea. How could this have happened? We had been so close to safety. The article mentioned that a suspect had been arrested, a local Uber driver named Francisco Valadez. He had allegedly confessed to the crime, stating he had picked her up after she left my vehicle. The details were horrifying. Then my phone rang. "Hello." I answered, my voice shaking. "This is Detective Harris with the Indianapolis PD. We need to ask you a few questions about a passenger you had last night." I froze. "This is about Chanty, isn't it?" The pause. "Yes. We have surveillance footage showing another vehicle following you. We need to confirm your route and the last time you saw her." I couldn't breathe. I replayed the night in my head, the strange car, the fear in Chanty's eyes, the moment I watched her disappear inside her home, thinking she was safe. "I'll come in right away," I whispered. The weight of those unanswered questions haunts me to this day. I never drove for Uber again. That wraps up tonight's Uber horror stories. Ordinary rides turned into nightmares, ghostly passengers, chilling warnings, and tragic fates. If you enjoyed these stories, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real-life horror. And remember, always check your back seat. Stay safe. Keep your doors locked.